Hvad så du i skoen?
Svar nu.
Ljuset, det var så stærkt.
I never thought 20 seconds could destroy two men's lives until I learned what really happened on that frozen December morning in Domsten, Sweden. What started as a simple bathroom break became an 11-hour police interrogation that would haunt these men forever, and what they discovered in those woods. Well, let me tell you, if you've ever felt like something was watching you in the dark, drop "watched" in the comments because you'll understand exactly what Hans and Stig went through. Picture this. December 20th, 1958. 3 in the morning on Route 45 near the tiny Swedish town of Domsten. The temperature was hovering just below freezing, and a thick fog rolled across the asphalt like ghostly fingers reaching through the pine trees. Hans Gustafsson, 25 years old with calloused hands from working his mother's dry cleaning business, was gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. Beside him, 30-year-old Stig Rydberg was fighting to keep his eyes open, the warmth from their girlfriend's farewell kisses still lingering on their lips from what felt like a lifetime ago. The road stretched ahead of them like a dark ribbon, completely deserted except for the occasional deer that would dart across their headlight beams. Hans could smell the familiar scent of pine needles and winter air seeping through the car's weather stripping, mixed with the faint odor of cigarettes and coffee that clung to their work clothes. They were making good time from Höganäs to Helsingborg, but exhaustion was creeping up on both of them like a predator stalking its prey. "Pull over, Hans," Stig muttered, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. "I need to stretch my legs and take a piss, or I'm going to fall asleep right here." Hans nodded, grateful for the excuse to stop. His back was aching from hunching over the wheel, and the monotonous drone of the engine was making his eyelids heavy. He guided the car onto the shoulder, the tires crunching over frost-covered gravel that sparkled like diamonds in the headlights. But the moment they stepped out into that bitter December air, everything changed. About 150 feet into the dark forest, cutting through the fog like a beacon from another world, was this strange, pulsating glow. At first, Hans thought maybe it was moonlight reflecting off an old hunting cabin or maybe some metallic debris from a crashed vehicle. But as they stood there, breath-forming small clouds in front of their faces, they realized this light was different. It didn't flicker like a fire, didn't move like reflected moonlight. It just existed, steady and unnatural and utterly mesmerizing. "You seeing this, Stig?" Hans whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of wind rustling through the pine branches. Stig nodded slowly, unable to look away. There was something about that glow that pulled at them, like a siren song made of light itself. Against every rational thought screaming in their heads, they found themselves walking toward the tree line, leaving the safety of their car behind. The forest was eerily quiet as they pushed through the underbrush, branches catching at their coats like skeletal fingers trying to hold them back. With each step closer, the light grew brighter, more intense, until it was bathing everything around them in this otherworldly phosphorescence that made their skin look pale and ghostly. The smell of pine gave way to something else, something metallic and sharp that made their nostrils flare. And then they saw it. In a small clearing marked by a weathered "no camping" sign that looked like it had been there since the war, sat the most impossible thing either man had ever laid eyes on. It was disc-shaped, about 15 feet across and maybe 3 feet high, perched on what looked like a tripod made of some kind of dull, metallic material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The entire object was pulsing with that strange glow, colors shifting and dancing across its surface like the northern lights had come down to earth. But that wasn't even the strangest part. As Hans and Stig stood there, mouths hanging open in disbelief, they began to notice movement around the base of the craft. At first, they thought their eyes were playing tricks on them, but as the seconds ticked by, there was no denying what they were seeing. These things were hopping around on the forest floor like enormous, living jellyfish that had somehow learned to move on land. They were about 3 feet long, bluish in color, and completely translucent, like they were made of some kind of organic jelly that pulsed with its own internal light. The way they moved was unlike anything in nature. Not quite bouncing, not quite sliding, but something in between that made Hans's stomach turn just watching them. And the smell. God, the smell was getting worse by the second. It was like someone had taken a handful of sausages and burned them over an open fire mixed with something chemical and wrong that made both men gag and cover their noses with their sleeves. But if you think that's where this story gets weird, you haven't heard anything yet. These living blobs suddenly stopped their bizarre dance around the craft and turned toward Hans and Stig with a coordination that was both perfect and terrifying. There were no eyes that they could see, no faces or features of any kind, yet somehow these things knew exactly where the two men were standing. And before either Hans or Stig could even think about running, these gelatinous nightmares came rushing toward them at a speed that defied everything they thought they knew about physics. The attack was unlike anything you could imagine. Within seconds, these living masses of jelly had swarmed over both men, latching onto their arms and legs with a grip that felt like magnetic dough mixed with wet cement. There was no heat, no cold, just this weird, pulsing pressure that seemed to seep through their clothes and into their skin. Hans screamed as one of the blobs wrapped itself around his right arm, the sensation like being grabbed by a giant, living glove made of thick honey. "Get off me! Get off!" Stig was yelling, swinging his free arm wildly as two of the creatures attached themselves to his legs. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. When Stig tried to punch one of these things, his fist went right through it like it was made of thick water, but then it didn't come back out easily. His entire arm was suddenly enveloped up to the elbow, and he could feel this strange suction, like the blob was trying to digest him from the outside in. The worst part. It was like these things could read their minds. Every move Hans and Stig tried to make, every desperate attempt to break free, it was like the blobs were anticipating it, already there waiting with another tentacle or appendage to grab hold. Hans would jerk to the left, and a blob would already be floating there to catch him. Stig would try to kick, and find his leg wrapped in that horrible, living jelly before his foot even moved. The panic was absolute. Both men were screaming now, their voices echoing through the forest as they fought against these impossible creatures that seemed to be everywhere at once. Hans managed to break free for just a moment and made a desperate lunge toward the "no camping" sign, wrapping his arms around the metal post like it was the mast of a sinking ship. He could feel the blobs pulling at his legs, trying to drag him back toward that pulsing disk, and he held on with every ounce of strength he had left. Meanwhile, Stig somehow tore himself away from the mass of creatures weighing him down and ran. He crashed through the underbrush like a madman, branches whipping across his face as he sprinted toward the car, leaving his best friend behind because his mind had simply snapped under the pressure of what he was experiencing. Behind him, he could hear Hans still screaming, still fighting, but all Stig could think about was getting to that car and getting the hell out of there. When Stig reached their vehicle, he threw himself into the driver's seat and started laying on the horn with both hands. He wasn't thinking clearly, just some desperate primal instinct that maybe, somehow, the sound would scare these things away or attract help from somewhere. The horn echoed through the forest like a wounded animal crying for its life, and amazingly, impossibly, it worked. The two blobs that had been chasing Stig suddenly stopped and turned back toward the forest. And bursting out of the tree line like a man possessed came Hans, running faster than he had ever run in his life. He dove into the passenger seat, gasping and shaking, his clothes torn and his face white as fresh snow. "They let go!" he was shouting between gasps for air. The moment that horn started, they just let go. And as if to punctuate his words, that disc-shaped object suddenly rose from the clearing, hovering there for just a moment like it was deciding what to do next, before shooting straight up into the night sky and disappearing among the stars as if it had never been there at all. The entire encounter, from the moment they first saw that glow until the craft vanished, had lasted maybe 5 minutes. But it took both men 20 minutes of sitting in that car, shaking like leaves in a hurricane, before either of them could even think about driving home. The smell lingered in the air around them, that horrible burned sausage stench that seemed to have soaked into their skin and clothes. Their hands were trembling so badly they couldn't even light cigarettes. When they finally made it back to Hans's mother's house, Anna Berggren took one look at her son and knew something terrible had happened. Both men were covered in unexplained bruises where those things had grabbed them. Their eyes were bloodshot and wild. And Stig. Poor Stig didn't sleep for 3 straight days. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel those gelatinous creatures crawling over his skin, could smell that nauseating odor, could hear Hans screaming in the darkness. What we would recognize today as severe PTSD was eating both men alive, but in 1958 rural Sweden, they had no name for what they were experiencing. Anna Berggren, bless her heart, believed her son and his friend completely. Maybe it was a mother's intuition, or maybe she could see the genuine terror in their eyes, but she knew they were telling the truth about something that should have been impossible. So she did what any concerned mother would do. She called Sweden's largest newspaper, the Helsingborgs Dagblad, and told them everything. It was a decision that would change Hans and Stig's lives forever, and not necessarily for the better. Within days, their story had spread like wildfire across Sweden and then around the world. UFO researchers descended on little Domsten like locusts. Reporters camped outside their homes, and suddenly 2 simple working men found themselves at the center of an international media circus they never asked for. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn, and if you've ever been questioned by police about something you know is true but sounds absolutely insane, you'll understand why what happened next was so devastating. On January 9, 1959, just a few weeks after their story went public, Hans and Stig were summoned to the local police station. They thought it would be a routine interview, maybe an hour or 2 of questions, so the authorities could file an official report. They had no idea they were walking into what would become the most grueling psychological torture either man would ever endure. 11 hours. 11 straight hours of relentless interrogation by officers who were absolutely convinced these 2 men were lying. They were separated, questioned individually, then brought back together and forced to repeat their story over and over again while detectives searched for any tiny inconsistency, any small detail that changed between tellings. The police were so determined to prove this was a hoax that they even secretly recorded Hans and Stig when they were left alone in the room, hoping to catch them whispering about their made-up story. Picture this. You've just experienced the most terrifying thing imaginable, something that has left you with actual physical injuries and psychological trauma, and now the very people who are supposed to protect you are treating you like criminals. They questioned every detail, the exact color of the glow, the precise size of the creatures, the specific smell, the duration of the encounter. They asked the same questions dozens of different ways, looking for any crack in their story, any sign that this was all an elaborate lie. But here's the thing that made this interrogation even worse. Hans and Stig never wavered. Not once. Not for 11 straight hours. Their story remained exactly the same, down to the smallest details. The color of the blobs, the sound the craft made as it took off, the way the creatures moved, the smell that lingered in the air, everything matched perfectly between both men, even when they were questioned separately. The psychological pressure was unbearable. These were simple men, workers who had never asked for fame or attention, who just wanted to go back to their normal lives. Instead, they were being treated like suspects in some elaborate conspiracy, their character assassinated by people who refused to believe something could exist outside their understanding of reality. After those 11 hours of hell, both men underwent extensive medical and psychiatric evaluations. The doctors found them to be completely sane, with no history of mental illness, no evidence of drug or alcohol abuse, no indication of any condition that would cause hallucinations. Every test came back normal. Every evaluation confirmed what Anna Berggren had known from the moment she saw her son that night. These men were telling the truth about something impossible. But the damage was done. The Swedish military, embarrassed by all the international attention this case was getting, declared the entire thing a hoax without offering any explanation for how 2 men could maintain such a detailed, consistent lie under 11 hours of professional interrogation. They provided no evidence for their claim, no alternative explanation for what Hans and Stig experienced, just a blanket dismissal designed to make the whole thing go away. The aftermath was devastating. Stig, who had already been struggling with severe insomnia and anxiety since the encounter, became even more withdrawn and paranoid. Hans tried to return to normal life, but everywhere he went, people either treated him like a celebrity or a liar. There was no middle ground, no peace to be found. The two friends, who had been through something that should have bonded them for life, found their relationship strained under the weight of public scrutiny and official skepticism. What makes this case so compelling isn't just the strangeness of what they reported, but the absolute consistency of their testimony and the physical and psychological evidence that supported their claims. These weren't attention seekers or publicity hounds. They were ordinary men who stumbled into something extraordinary and paid a terrible price for telling the truth about it. The Domsten blobs, as the case became known in UFO circles, remains one of the most well-documented and thoroughly investigated close encounters in history. But for Hans Gustafsson and Stig Rydberg, it was never about becoming famous or contributing to our understanding of the unknown. It was about surviving something that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality, and then having to survive the aftermath when the world refused to believe them. Today, more than 60 years later, their story continues to fascinate and disturb people around the world. Some dismiss it as an elaborate hoax despite the lack of evidence for such a claim. Others see it as proof that we share this world with intelligences we don't understand. But for those of us who have experienced something that defies explanation, something that leaves physical marks and psychological scars that last a lifetime, Hans and Stig's story rings with the unmistakable sound of truth. The real tragedy isn't what happened to them in those woods outside Domsten. It's what happened afterward, when two honest men discovered that sometimes the truth is the most dangerous thing you can tell. Sometimes the cost of witnessing the impossible is higher than anyone should have to pay. If you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain, something that left you questioning everything you thought you knew about reality, let me know in the comments. And if this story has made you think twice about what might be lurking in the dark corners of our world, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, stories that challenge everything we think we know about what's possible. The truth is out there, but sometimes the price of finding it is higher than we ever imagined.